GTM Podcast Buddhist Knowledge 38 Blessing of Life Blessing 13 Part 1 Hello everyone. You are listening to GTM Podcast Buddhist Knowledge series on 38 Blessing of Life. Currently, we have reached Blessing 13 and this is the first part of the introduction. From the previous episode, we learned about how to care for our children. In this episode, we will go on cherishing your spouse. Before we begin, if you have not listened to the previous episode just yet, for more understanding and continuous series, maybe you might want to check it out before you start. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to help us and continue support our program. Now let us begin on Blessing 13, Cherish Your Spouse. Introduction. Aim in life. Marriage versus celibacy. In some cultures, such as those of Indonesia, there are only two logical answers to the question, are you married? Yes or not yet. Western culture might not see marriage as quite so much of an obligation, but it should be declared from the outset with that just because the Buddha says cherishing one's spouse is a blessing does not mean there are not superior ways to become blessed. Rather than advocating marriage, what the Buddha meant in teaching this blessing is to remind us to avoid the dire consequences of having a spouse and not cherishing them. Marriage can be a minefield. Thus, if you don't have a spouse and don't plan on procuring one, you can skip this blessing with a sigh of relief. For Westerners, marriage has traditionally been portrayed as the high point of happiness in life. The fathers of the Western attitudes, the ancient Greek philosophers, have seized the delusions of idyllic matrimony with the sentimental idea about a man and woman mutually searching for the other half, who would make them complete, oblivious to the fact that you could say the same about rabbits, ducks, crows, or any other sort of animal feeling its urge to mate. Consequently, celibacy does not feature visibly as a demographic option in the West. Buddhism, by contrast, based its practice on the conviction that everyone can be complete in themselves if they train themselves earnestly. As mentioned in Blessing 6, Buddhism idealized the exclusively spiritual aim in life, and thus the Buddha advocated a life of celibacy because life as a couple always leads to compromise in the intensity of which one can cultivate ultimate peace and purity of mind. In many non-Western cultures around the world, celibacy is an option chosen more and more by professionals, especially women, who want to devote their time and efforts to their life's work. They realize that otherwise, because of the expectations of society, marrying would involve a conscious decision to drop their career. It is also a traditional in many Asian cultures for couples to become celibate in their married relationship after their own children have grown up and left home. Those with the inner strength to renounce the married life can thereby enter the fast lane of spiritual development. However, in practicality, renunciation of the married life is difficult because it requires the ability to see through the illusory nature of the self and the sense pleasures. Most people realize the truth only when they are already married and now find themselves settled for the rest of their lives with the more detestable side of their partner. Buddhism accepts the reality that renunciation is not for everyone, and thus does not decry marriage. Even if the idea of renunciation appeals to you, once married, you cannot just shrug off the duties you have taken on yourself. You need to take proper responsibility for creating happiness in your marriage. To make a success of the path of life you have chosen for yourself. Although the married life doesn't correspond to the highest aim in life, nonetheless, if one can cultivate contentment with one's spouse and thereby avoid promiscuity, it can give considerable leverage in one's self-development. Creating success in marriage is a major way of cultivating goodness of character. It is to such listeners that this blessing is directed. Wrongly approach marriage, a nightmare turning the closest of lovers into the worst of enemies. By contrast, a properly fulfilled marriage will be long-lasting, avoiding the bitterness of divorce and creating blessing both for that couple and for society as a whole. However, be warned, most of the content of the Buddhist scriptures deal with the monastic issues and thus tend to idealize those who, through the folly of their marriage, subsequently renouncing the world, or those who marry only reluctantly out of respect for their parents' wishes, renouncing the world after the passing of their parents. Long-term relationships, marriage versus living together. Buddhism advocates celibacy. It tolerates marriage, but prohibits promiscuity under its definition of adultery. Although Buddhism's definition of marriage is not black and white, it is clear that Buddhism does not support sexual relations between partners who take no responsibility for one another or the possible consequences of their liaisons. Let us examine the worst scenario for some of the material and abstract issues touched upon as the consequence of sexual relationships. 1. Sexually transmitted disease could be possibly fatal. 2. Pregnancy, possibility of handicapped child and subsequent miscarriage. 3. Emotional trauma and regret. 4. Damage to reputation. 5. General undermining of health. 6. Erosion of deeper meaning in the relationship by ephemeral pleasures. Buddhism prohibits abortion. It is murder of an unborn child, but does not prohibit contraception. Recourse to contraception might superficially seem to remove responsibility for 1 and 2 that mentioned earlier. But closer examination reveals that contraception does not offer 100% protection from either. Who is going to be there for the girl to comfort her if she has miscarriage? Who is going to pay for the upbringing of a child born out of wedlock? Will he still love her if she is disfigured by infections with HIV? These are consequences which apply irrespective of the cultural traditions of the society you find yourself in. The listener can answer for themselves what sort of relationship a couple needs to have built for themselves to be willing to shoulder all 6 of these possible risks implicit in their sexual liaison. For a couple to face up mutually to the responsibilities of having together and having sexual intercourse demands enormous sacrifice on both sides. It is these sacrifices and responsibilities the Buddha teaches about in the 13th blessing. On a brighter note, living together should not be the end of young people's idealism. It can and should be the start of something yet more beautiful. At this point, it should be added, however, that the Western mass media consistently lull the public into false sense of security concerning the risk of promiscuous sex. Thus, this is just only the first part of the introduction for this 13th blessing. We will continue on the next part, Sexual Discrimination in Buddhism. Hope you enjoy learning from this Buddhist wisdom. Stay tuned and please continue to support us by subscribe, like and share. Until then, next time.